Hello and welcome to 52 Weeks. This is week 13. Now, I wasn't going to break up this into 3 parts, chapter 3 into 3 parts, but it made sense. The last part I wanted to focus on, this would be a little shorter, is the churches of Harrisburg. So this is a lot of the buildings that should be in historic register. We'll also talk about ones that are. So there's the National Register of Historic Places, and there's a list from Dauphin County that you can go and look at on the web links that I have. In this discussion, we're going to go through the churches that aren't on the historic register. This is important to note because when you look at the history of Harrisburg, Harrisburg has been the capital of Pennsylvania since 1812. But prior to that, the planning of Harrisburg was laid out in 1785. What I find interesting is the amount of churches that came after that. When we start to look at what got built, there were churches that were built before the laying out of Harrisburg. So back in December of 2018, the Susquehanna Conference of the United Methodist Church decided to consolidate the churches in Harrisburg. So there's 10 churches that are getting consolidated. So this is interesting in the consolidation of the 10 United Methodist churches. There are 5 in Harrisburg, and that is Derry Street UMC at 1508 Derry Street, First Harrisburg UMC at 260 Boas Street, Riverside UMC at 3200 North 3rd Street, Camp Curtin Memorial Mitchell UMC at 2221 North 6th Street, Grace Harrisburg UMC at 216 State Street, and 29th Street Methodist out at 29th and Derry. So these are other churches we're looking at in Harrisburg that are significant within the urban fabric. So the first one was First Church of God, and that closed in 2015 and ran for 150 years. That was in 1865. Market Street Presbyterian Church opened in 1794. And then number 3, Zion Lutheran Church in 1815. Number 4, Bethel Village AME Church, 1835. Messiah Lutheran Church in 1864. St. Francis of Assisi Church in 1901. Mount Calvary Church of God, 1955, although the building was earlier. Number 8 is Harrisburg Unitarian Church, a Unitarian congregation formed in 1826, and the building they're currently in is the former United Methodist and United Church of Christ building, which I didn't have any data on. And we have the Our Lady of the Blessed Sacrament is 1929. Churches that are on the National Register is Camp Curtin Memorial Mitchell Methodist Episcopal Church, and that was built in 1895. The German Evangelical Zion Lutheran Church, otherwise known as the Tabernacle Baptist Church, which is operating in there now, is 1886. And we have the Salem United Church of Christ, 1821. So those buildings, these last 3 buildings were on the National Register. The other 9 buildings that are listed are ones that should be considered. There's also, besides the churches of United Methodist, there's also some additional churches on State Street to mention. St. Lawrence Chapel, 1868, St. Michael's Lutheran, 1906, and St. Patrick's Cathedral, 1907. There are also other buildings in Harrisburg that are religious buildings that should be designated. This part of the comp plan is only look at historical buildings of a historic nature, and looking at how they're knitted into the communities of regular building fabric. So these are things to be considered in our national resources. It would be good to go through. I encourage others in the neighborhood planning and any citizen planning efforts that are done to go out and do some crowdsource and crowd mapping and asset mapping of what's in your neighborhood as far as current religious facilities or nonprofit organizations. These are assets to our community and something that provides some social infrastructure for us to gather. So these are things to build social capital and things that we should consider and pass along to our next generation of why they're important. Lastly, the thing to be thinking about is there's some more references to look at the timeline of Harrisburg's history. I have that link here. Also, the City Beautiful movement to look at that. There's also some interesting input with the Susquehanna River flooding, things that we're going to deal with in the next chapter, chapter 4, with parks and open space, civic and open spaces, and also some 8th Ward discussions. There's some really good history coming out of the 8th Ward that many people are writing about and focused on, which is really good because we're thinking about this comp plan, what happens when we deal with changes in our city, and we're going to go through a period of growth in the next 10, 20 years that's going to be significant, and I think people need to be aware of it. And part of that is passing along our history to the next generation, and that is all history to the next generation. I think the African American population and persons of color in Harrisburg are very underrepresented, and it would be good for us to look at how this can be reconciled and continue to work into the future and bring out that history, especially when it's a lot of history that I know students, when I talk to students in passing, that they're unfamiliar with in Harrisburg. So this is good to know and continue to pass along. So if we can put in any more links, if you have any comments down below of good resources, continue to put them in there. So thanks again for listening. This is the end of the Chapter 3 Natural Resources section. Join us next week as we begin to go through Chapter 4, which is Parks, Civic, and Open Spaces. Thanks again for listening. Take care.